Good evening, everybody, and welcome to IF Oxford, the Science and Ideas Festival. My name's Kathy, I'm the festival manager, and I'll be your host this evening. With me tonight are Dr. Dafydd Mills-Daniel. He's from the University of Oxford and lectures in theology, ethics, and intellectual history. And we also have with us Dr. Joe Cunningham, also from the University of Oxford, lecturing in philosophy and ethics. And tonight's session, we're going to recreate an 18th century debate between two Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire and Rousseau. And we're going to be debating whether humans are responsible for natural disasters. So I think it's probably time to hand over to our first speaker, Dafydd Mills-Daniel. He's just unmuted himself, so over to you, Dafydd.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Hello to everyone. So greetings from where I am, which is a sort of rather wet West Yorkshire. So I hope all of you are well wherever you are. What I'm going to do here is just work out how to drop into this my PowerPoint, which seems to have gone awry somewhere. Maybe if I just share my screen is the best way to do that. Here we go. So hopefully this will now appear. So thanks so much for coming along, all of you. Obviously, Joe and I are very much looking forward to this. We quickly realized we wouldn't be in the same room to deliver it to all of you. So I'm going to take care of the historical part of our debate, are humans responsible for natural disasters, before Joe takes you through the contemporary issues and ramifications of this debate. So let's start. We go back to the 1st of November 1755, the Lisbon earthquake. About 9:30 a.m. An earthquake occurs in the Atlantic Ocean, followed by a tsunami, which you can see depicted here in some 18th century artwork. The earthquake and the tidal waves destroyed the city of Lisbon and killed thousands of people, not just in Portugal, but also along the coasts of Europe, Africa, and South America. And the effects of this earthquake were literally felt around the world. It's been estimated that the earthquake was the equivalent of 475 megatons of TNT, and that 3% of the world's surface was affected in some form. And it does actually remain the most powerful earthquake to ever strike the continent of Europe. But as we're going to talk about tonight, the effects of the earthquake were not just physical, they were also philosophical, theological, and ethical, or at least they were in the home of this man, the French philosopher known by his pen name Voltaire. So banished from France and Prussia as a result of his radical writings, as well as a fair few personal indiscretions, Voltaire was living in Geneva when the Lisbon earthquake occurred. And the devastation of the earthquake caused Voltaire to doubt. And what he came to doubt was his optimism. And when I say that Voltaire came to doubt his optimism, I mean that literally, in the sense that the actual word optimism was first coined in 1737 to describe the theories of this man, the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, with his wonderful wig there. So it was Leibniz's philosophy, his optimism, that Voltaire felt the Lisbon earthquake entirely disproved. So we're just going to talk a little bit about this optimism and what it meant in the 18th century. So according to Leibniz, disasters like the Lisbon earthquake were in effect not really disasters, and certainly not things we could call evil. People who are optimists, 18th century, would admit that earthquakes, plagues, hurricanes, those sorts of things cause destruction and loss of life. But at the same time, they could cite that old adage, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And so just as it's the omelette, the end result, that makes all those broken eggs worthwhile, we just have to believe to trust optimistically that all this destruction is necessary for some reason, even if we don't know what the actual reason is. So what we got with Leibniz are some basic sort of philosophical beliefs that underpin his optimism, where his faith was not just that God exists, but that God possesses these fundamental attributes, that God is all-knowing, he's all-powerful, he's all-loving. He's in effect the best of all possible gods. And because Leibniz thought that God was the best of all possible gods, then inevitably this God would create the best of all possible worlds. And this is the phrase that's really associated with Leibniz. So God has to create the best of all possible worlds because God is supremely wise. He has the perfection of wisdom. And so, of course, he's not going to do anything else but create the best possible world. So what's going on in Leibniz is a way of having an optimistic view of the world, of reality, that solves the problem of evil. The problem of evil, as you can guess by the fact there's a triangle on there, one way of talking about it is a thing called the inconsistent triad. Right, so let's say, who is God? God is omnipotent. Okay, so he's all powerful. That's fine. What else is he? He's all good, omnibenevolent. If he's those things, then why does this happen? Why does evil exist? Okay. Now, this is an old problem in the history of Christian theology, philosophy. I've got here Augustine, one of the early church fathers, African church father, Augustine of Hippo, and he pointed out this inconsistency. Can God abolish evil, but he doesn't? Then he's not all powerful. Would he actually be capable of abolishing evil but doesn't do it? Then obviously he's not going to be all good. So that's the question that theists, people who believe in God, have to answer. The optimist actually has their own answer. So we had Leibniz. Another major figure in 18th century thought for this was the English poet Alexander Pope. And Alexander Pope put it quite sort of straightforwardly in one of his poems. So all nature is art. So it's art created by God. We can't see its artistic merit as human beings within this work of art. To us, everything seems to happen randomly, just by chance. And that's part of why things that happen seem to us to be evil. But actually, everything that happens is directed. It's directed by divine providence, by God's plan for the universe. And so that means that we have to say, as Pope does there, whatever is right. Whatever happens seems to be evil, seems to be bad, but it's actually right because it's following God's plan. Now, as I mentioned, Voltaire, depicted here again, he found this view ridiculous as a result of the Lisbon earthquake. It was silly, frankly, the way he puts it in his works, as well as offensive. And there's two major works associated with Voltaire here. I've got the poem on the Lisbon disaster, which he wrote. You see they're published in 1756 anonymously, and also, perhaps more famously, Candide, his comic novel in 1759. And it's Candide that I'm going to talk about a little bit more first. So, first thing to note about Candide is that you can see that it is about rejecting optimism, because that is the subtitle of the satire, Candide or Optimism. And what we have in the story is this young man, Candide, traveling around the world with his mentor, the philosopher Pangloss. And Pangloss is a fairly obvious stooge for Leibniz in the story. And it just so happens that whilst Candide and Pangloss are traveling around the place, they end up in Lisbon just as the earthquake strikes. And this is what Pangloss has to say when the earthquake hits. You can see what he's doing is consoling the people around them. He's reassuring them, telling that things couldn't be otherwise. So why should we not be afraid or distressed by this apparent disaster? Well, because everything is the best it could be. Everything is where it should be. There might be a volcano under Lisbon that's caused this disaster, but if that's the case, God put the volcano there, and he put it there for a reason. So this earthquake must have a reason. It must have an explanation. And so this leads then to the conclusion, which Voltaire makes the sort of summary of Leibniz and optimism: all is well. Whatever happens in the world, whatever you confront, you just say all is well, because everything is functioning according to an intricate plan that God has for the universe. Now, Candide is also there when the earthquake strikes, and he has a slightly different reaction, which is that he's shocked, he's bewildered, taken aback, covered in blood. He's aware of the injuries that are going on. He's shaking. And so he says, if this is the best of all possible worlds, what on earth are the others like? So you have in that phrase, clearly these comic riposte. You can imagine in 18th century France, they're all rolling around reading that. It's rejecting Leibniz, this Leibniz view of the best of all possible worlds. But you can see that there's another point that Voltaire is getting at here. Candide's reaction to injury, distress, suffering, to be confused by it, is not just more human. For Voltaire, it's more insightful. The fact that there is evil, suffering, injury in the world is something that we have to confront and to think about. It's not something we can ignore. Pangloss, Leibniz might have these elaborate philosophies saying, well, everything is where it's meant to be, all is well. But that ignores the fundamental question of reality. It's something we have to grapple with. And these were the same points that Voltaire brought up when he wrote his original poem, When the Earthquake Struck. So you can see here, this is his preface to the poem. And he wants to say that physical evil, natural disasters, this is a question. And it's a question that deserves the attention of all human beings. It's a question that forces us to contemplate our feeble nature, the fact that we live in a harsh environment where we have plagues, something obviously on our minds today, as well as earthquakes. I mean, why is this the case? Why is it the fact that human beings live in an environment which does us so much harm? And in the poem, then, he wants to say, Leibniz can tell me from what secret cause, or can't tell me from what secret cause, in a world governed by the wisest laws, lasting disorders, woes that never end, with our vain pleasures, real sufferings blend. So, in other words, this Leibniz's system can't explain this central problem of life. The fact that we are vulnerable, we're weak, we die seemingly at random from random events, and also the fact that the pleasures that we have in this life don't always, Voltaire saying very rarely, compensate for the amount of suffering that we face. Again, you see here Voltaire returning to that line from Alexander Pope mentioned earlier. All is well as in Candide from Leibniz. Pope said in his poem, whatever is right. Voltaire says, well, look, the universe, the fact of suffering, disasters like Lisbon, they just prove that that is a boast, right? A boast in vain. It doesn't have any meaning or purpose when we really look at the issues around us. And so he puts it, O wretched man, earth fated to be cursed, abyss of plagues and miseries the worst. Horrors on horrors, griefs on griefs must show that man's the victim of unceasing woe. Again, Voltaire's point here is that we have to confront these problems, talk about them, think about them, but something even more than that. The system of Leibniz and Pope ignores the fact of suffering. It minimizes it. It says, don't worry about the fact that you're suffering, that thing's a problem, because everything all works out for the best in the end. So your suffering actually in a sort of odd way is good if you don't obsess over it and worry about it too much. And Voltaire thinks that this is an insult to what goes on in our lives. And an insult not just because of the real suffering we all face, but because of what it means about our status as individuals. So what he's saying here, so if the miseries of individuals are nothing but the consequence of this general and necessary order, then we're nothing but cogs that make a great machine work. We are no more precious in the eyes of God than the animals that eat us. This image of a machine was one of Leibniz's image, comes to dominate early modern philosophy and science. You've got this idea of the world being an intricate machine created by God to function in a particular way. This is why everything that happens for the best. Well, Voltaire wants to point out, if that's the case, then our individual suffering is insignificant because our status as individuals is insignificant. We're just grinded up like cogs by cogs in some larger machine. And so really what he's saying is that optimism, tries to keep the existence of God in a universe of suffering, but actually at the same time gets rid of any personal idea of God. God clearly does not love us personally, and at my individual status, there's no point in me loving God personally, because I matter much less than the whole system he's created. Now, Voltaire raises these problems with optimism. Does he have an answer? Well, of sorts, in his pessimism. So one thing that he wants to point out as a pessimist is to say that we are tormented on the earth, right? There is evil, there is suffering. We can't ignore that. Also, that it happens at random. That's crucial here, the sport of fate. We can't just say, well, it's all a plan, it all happens to clockwork and everything else. There's something random about it. And so random, in fact, the evil, we all will die. Our natural death is a fact that we have to face. Now that doesn't seem like much of an answer. It remains pessimistic. In Candide later on, it has an enigmatic ending where Candide says, we must tend our garden. And what Voltaire's idea here seems to be is that, okay, there's nothing human beings can do about the injustice of the universe, the injustice of natural disasters, plagues, hurricanes that take place at random, about the injustice of us all dying. But we can do something about injustice in human society, the garden that we're responsible for, moral evil, the actions that we have that we can control. And so the other character there, Martin, is saying, if we stop philosophizing, we stop creating systems to explain evil, and we recognize that evil for evil, maybe we can actually take charge of human society and do something about the ills in the world that we are responsible for. Okay. So Voltaire, well, he writes his poem. It comes to the attention of this man, another great French philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Rousseau reads it because Voltaire sends it to him. So that's always a useful way of getting people to read what you've written. And Rousseau is not impressed at what he reads, so he sends Voltaire a letter telling him so. Rousseau didn't publish the letter himself. It was a private letter, published later on without his permission. It doesn't have a title then, but it's sometimes referred to as the letter on providence. And what Rousseau is doing is trying to defend optimism, and he's trying to defend optimism against Voltaire's pessimism. And again, when I was calling here Voltaire a pessimist, I again mean this literally, in the sense that just as the word optimist was coined to describe Leibniz in the 18th century, so the word pessimist was coined in the 18th century to describe Voltaire. So the words pessimism and optimism come into existence at the same time around this debate of the Lisbon disaster. So what do we have? Well, Voltaire, these are quotations here from Rousseau's letter to Voltaire. So he's saying, well, he doesn't find optimism cruel in the same way that Voltaire does. In fact, he finds optimism reassuring and Voltaire's pessimism cruel. So again, he's defending Pope and Leibniz, as you can see there. And why is it? Well, what he likes in Pope and Leibniz is that they say that the ills, the suffering and evil in the world are a necessary consequence of the way the universe is. That God would have wished to have protected us from disasters if he could have done. And if he hasn't protected us from that, that's simply because he couldn't design a better universe. Okay, so what Rousseau is getting at here is a complexity in being an optimist that he thinks Voltaire has ignored. And it really revolves around that phrase, the best of all possible worlds. One naive way of reading that phrase is just everything that happens for the best. Every event, no matter how bad it seems, has the best consequences overall. That's the naive way of reading it. There's also a more modest way of having that phrase as an optimist, which is to say, what happens is just the best thing that could happen. It's just the best that there is. It's just the best way things could be. So what Rousseau is saying is that the optimist can accept the world isn't perfect, that there's evil in the world, but that's just the best way things could possibly be. What you'll note here from that phrase of mentioning God is that Rousseau is still grappling with this problem of evil, where we're confronted by the type of nature God has in the world he creates. Does he have these perfections? that inconsistent triad, all good, all powerful. David Hume, 18th century philosopher, raised that very influentially there. You can see him putting it again. I mentioned Augustine earlier. Is God willing to prevent evil, but he's not able? He's clearly not all powerful. Does he just not want to prevent evil? Well, in that case, he's obviously not a good being. Rousseau, just admits, takes the problem straight on and says, well, I'm quite happy to give up the idea that God is all powerful. God is simply all good. He wanted to create the best world he could. He couldn't make it perfect because he wasn't all powerful. And that's it. That's why it's not perfection. So that's one element of Rousseau's response. The other is something else which we call, or is often called, the sociology of disaster. Rousseau is one of the first proponents of this, where evil, natural evil, concerns not just events in nature, but the way humans interact with nature. And so you can see Rousseau saying in this letter to Voltaire, most of the physical evils we experience are of our own making. So what does he mean by that? When, you know, he's not saying that human beings created the earthquake in Lisbon, but he's writing to Voltaire, telling him, well, you know, you're bringing up Lisbon. Even in the case of this earthquake, you have to acknowledge that it wasn't nature that made human beings build houses in such a way they would topple easily when an earthquake happened, and filled those housings with so many human beings that so many people would die when they did fall. Also, Rousseau saying how many people rushed back into their homes when the earthquake happened to get their possessions, their clothes, their papers, their money. And it was by rushing back into the buildings that the disaster became evil, or more evil, because that resulted in more deaths than there needed to be. And this feeds into a wider criticism that Rousseau has in his philosophy of bourgeois society, or really human society itself, as an artifice that human beings have constructed within nature, and artificial when it comes to human nature as well as the natural world. And it's because we're structuring this artificial component of life, we're becoming interested in the wrong things. And that is what is causing us not to live in harmony with nature. So it's because, in effect, we're bourgeois society and we're obsessed with our status, our wealth, and so on, that we're getting in the way of nature. Another aspect here is the point that Rousseau makes, that human beings decide what we call disaster. It's a word that we use and we apply to things. And so what we call disaster, evil, are things that most affect us. So Voltaire, in his poem, had said, you know, if the world is this perfect machine created by God, as the optimist claims, then why didn't God organize the world so the earthquake only happened in a desert where no human beings were killed? Well, Rousseau points out how human-centric that view is. Maybe earthquakes do happen in deserts. We don't call them a disaster because we don't care if nature is harmed or if animals are harmed, only if human beings are harmed. And even more than this, a greater point for Rousseau, not just human beings, but as he puts it here, we don't discuss them because they do no harm to city dwellers, the only human beings to whom we attribute any significance. So again, Lisbon, the fourth major city in Europe at the time, the great suffering of life amongst city dwellers, the elite within this human society that has been constructed, and that's why we're calling it a disaster. So this then feeds into Rousseau's wider points: self-obsession, obsession with one's own belongings, obsession with being European city dweller and elite, and also an obsession with being human rather than thinking about the other aspects to the universe. So he says here that he does prefer to believe to hope. He admits it is a belief and a hope, that he as an individual is more important in the eyes of God than simply the earth or the animals. But at the same time, he does have to admit that if the universe, the whole universe, everything that is in existence is an entire system created by God, and God governs the whole thing, then maybe everything about his life, or even life on earth, can't always be at the center of the system itself. So he points out that, you know, there could be the earthquake in Lisbon might in some way benefit the aliens on Saturn, and so which case I have to accept that. In this last paragraph here, what he's saying here is getting to the fact of death, that we all die at some point at the end of our lives. And Voltaire views this as the paradigmatic suffering and pointlessness in human life. Well, you know, we die as individuals, we're taken back into the ground, we're then consumed by the animals, and then other human beings eat the animals. Rousseau pointing here that that is actually some comfort to us all as we suffer in this life. Okay, so obviously a lot that we've already put on the table. I'm just going to review a few points about Voltaire and Rousseau before we move on to looking at its contemporary relevance today. So what I put on here on these slides are a couple of ways of summarizing the position of Voltaire on optimism, Rousseau on pessimism. So Voltaire: evil is loose on the earth, saying all is well is nothing but an insult to the suffering of our lives. That's his rejection of optimism. Rousseau rejecting pessimism: if it isn't always an evil to die, still it is very rarely an evil to have to live. So what's going on here? Well, Voltaire is saying there that optimism fails to take seriously life, existence, because it claims that life is perfect, the best that it could be, and because of that it minimizes evil. It denies that evil is loose on the earth. And in that way it insults and ignores the struggles that we face in life, and actually encourages us to be passive, to be fatalistic, and not deal with the evils we can control in human society. Rousseau, on the other hand, though, wants to say that pessimism fails to take life seriously because its disappointment in discovering that life isn't perfect leads pessimists to overemphasize evil and suffering. And when we start to overemphasize evil, suffering in the world, we then ignore what actually is of value, what there is to enjoy in life, even though it is imperfect. Right, so that's general summary. Now, what I'm going to do is put up this other slide, and then I will post it into the chat. But this is where you're going to start to vote. So the vote option will appear, and we're going to ask you if you're more of a Voltaire or a Rousseau. You might feel that you're not really one or the other, but we're going to force you to make a choice as much as possible. Which are you closest to? And so a general way of framing this is that Voltaire is saying human beings aren't responsible for natural disasters for the reasons I've discussed, and Rousseau is saying that human beings are responsible for natural disasters. So if we can ask you to vote, start your voting now. I'll take this slide down now and make room for Joe, but I'll paste this slide into the chat function so you can still look at it as things continue.
Okay, thanks very much, Dafydd. So we'll just give you a minute or two to carry out your voting and have a think, a bit of a breather between the two halves of the talk. And in the meantime, I'll share my screen, get my slides up for you. All right, so thanks very much, Dafydd, for that overview of the historical debate between Rousseau and Voltaire, dealing with concepts like natural disaster, evil, and divine providence. So what I want to do in my half of the talk is I'm going to hone in particular on this idea of divine providence, and I'm going to abstract it from the historical setting that Dafydd just talked you through. I'm going to hone in on the idea itself, examine some of its philosophical implications, as well as hopefully attempting to clarify the idea too. Okay. So in particular, I'm going to do four things. So first of all, I'm going to offer some philosophical thoughts that are intended to clarify the idea of divine providence. What is divine providence? Okay, I'm going to try and address that question. And then I'm going to look at or revisit the problem of natural evil. This is a problem for the providentialist, the person who believes in divine providence. Okay, and look at a couple of ways in which the providentialist might respond to that problem. We're then going to look at a fresh problem, a problem concerning the relationship between divine providence and human responsibility. And look at what some contemporary philosophical theories of free will have to say about that. And then finally, I'm going to finish up by applying some of these reflections to the current COVID-19 crisis. That's what's on the agenda during this sort of 20-25 minute bit. Okay, good. So let's begin with the following question. What is divine providence? This is the idea that I'm going to be spending my time talking about now. So, I mean, what is it? Well, in a nutshell, okay, the basic idea of divine providence is sort of like the idea of fate, but with a theological and an optimistic twist. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Okay, so the proponent of divine providence, the providentialist, thinks that there exists this supernatural entity, God, that has properties like being all-knowing, being all-powerful, being perfectly good. And then there's the world, God's creation, and the events that unfold in the world. Okay, according to the providentialist, these two entities are intimately connected. Okay, the events that actually happen in the world are events which unfold in perfect accordance with God's plan. Okay, they must unfold in accordance with God's plan. Given God's plan, the events that actually happen must be the events that happen, because whatever happens unfolds perfectly in accordance with God's plan. Okay. Moreover, because God is perfectly good, okay, the plan is perfectly good. It couldn't be improved from the moral point of view. And because the events of nature, the events of the world, unfold in perfect accordance with that ideally good plan, the events of the world are themselves the ideally good events. The course of history is morally ideal. This is the best of all possible worlds from the moral point of view. Okay. So as I say, divine providence, this is the idea, sort of like fate, but with a theological and an optimistic twist. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to explore a couple of problems for the providentialist, for the believer in divine providence. I'm going to start with the most famous one. This is the problem of evil. And Dafydd touched on this earlier in his talk. Just a side note, I mean, one very obvious way of responding to the providentialist, one very obvious way of criticizing the idea is just to argue that God doesn't exist. Okay, just to embrace the atheist's position. So I'm not going to engage with that sort of flat-footed response to providentialism at the moment. I think it's more interesting to kind of accept the basic assumption of theism and then to raise the question of whether, even against the background of the assumption of theism, divine providence still makes sense. Okay, so that's the question that I'm going to be pursuing. And the first sort of objection to the proponent of divine providence that we're going to consider is the problem of evil, as I say. Okay, so what's the problem? Okay, well, in short, the problem is that there are events that occur in the natural world which are bad, very bad things. They involve much suffering, for example, on the part of human beings and animals. Okay, they're bad from the moral point of view, but they also seem to us to be unnecessary. There's no moral justification for them, right? If we were to delete those events from history, we'd end up with a world that's better from the moral point of view, and nothing would be lost. Okay. These are events of apparently unjustified natural evil. Okay. And the Lisbon earthquake and the COVID crisis are examples of events with this character. Okay. Now, the problem for the providentialist should be obvious, right? If the events of the universe unfold in perfect accordance with God's plan, and that plan is ideally good, okay, then the universe is an ideally good place from the moral point of view. But then it can't be that there exists an alternative universe which is better from the moral point of view. And yet it kind of looks like we can easily conceive of a universe that would be better, one in which everything is the same, but these events of unnecessary natural evil don't occur. Okay, that's the problem of evil in a nutshell for the providentialist. Okay, is this a damning problem? Is this the end for providentialism? Let's explore a couple of ways in which the theist, the believer in providentialism, might respond. Okay. So response one is quite heavy-handed. It says, well, actually, look, these events of natural evil, they are justified from the moral point of view. Okay. Why? Because they're effectively acts of God punishing us for past misdeeds. We have in the past done things which we're obliged by God not to do. Okay. And natural evil is just the punishment God sends to us for those misdeeds. Okay. And of course, punishment, as we all acknowledge, is in principle appropriate from the moral point of view. We punish people who break the criminal law all the time, for example. Okay. So these events, although they're bad, they involve suffering, all things considered, they're justified as acts of divine punishment. Okay, that's one kind of heavy-handed response to the problem of evil that the providentialists can give. I mean, there's lots of things to say there. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts during the Q&A. I mean, I suppose one way of kind of pushing back against this would be to say, this just kind of pushes the problem back a step, right? Because now we can ask, well, wouldn't the universe have been a better place, all things considered, if we'd have never performed the misdeeds that we have performed? Okay, so that God didn't have to punish us. Okay, maybe these events of natural evil are punishment for our misdeeds. Okay, so they're morally justified. But nevertheless, we can perfectly well conceive of an alternate universe in which the misdeeds were never engaged in. Why didn't God create that universe? And that would be better, wouldn't it? It's kind of one way of pushing back against this response. That's not the only response to the problem of evil that's open to the providentialist. Dafydd touched on this earlier. There's a response that is associated with Pope and Leibniz. Okay. This is it's all part of the plan response. According to this response to the problem of evil, again, events of seemingly unjustified natural evil, they merely seem unjustified from the moral point of view. If only we knew God's plan in its entirety, we'd be able to see that events of natural evil are justified, all things considered, from the moral point of view. Okay. It's because of a cognitive limitation on our part that these events seem to be morally unjustified. Okay, but they're not really. Okay. So it's all part of the plan. If only we knew the plan in its entirety, we'd see that the events are justified. Okay. This is the kind of Popian and Leibnizian response, right? I mean, again, there's various ways in which you might push back against this. Okay, so again, you might worry that this just pushes the problem back a step, because now we can ask, well, okay, maybe these events in the natural world are these events of natural evil are justified from a moral point of view. We're not able to tell that they are, but in fact they are. Okay, maybe that's coherent. But now we can ask, well, couldn't God have created us so that we were able to tell that they were justified? Couldn't God have created us so that we weren't cognitively limited in the way in question? Wouldn't that be a better world? Okay, why is it good for us to have these cognitive limitations? So you might think this response also just kind of pushes the problem back a step. Okay. Okay, good. So there's the first problem with providence. I've tried to clarify the idea of providence, and I've looked at the problem of natural evil, okay, and a couple of ways of responding to that problem. Let's now look at a fresh problem, one which was only implicitly touched on during Dafydd's part of the talk. This is a problem concerning the relationship between divine providence, fate, and responsibility, moral responsibility. Okay. In a nutshell, the problem is that if providentialism is true, human beings can't be held responsible from the moral point of view for what they do. Okay. Why? What's the argument? Okay. So divine providence, as I mentioned, is kind of like fatalism, but with a theological and optimistic twist. Okay. It's the fatalism bit which contributes to the existence of this problem that I'm about to identify. If divine providence is true, then the events that happen must happen. Okay. The events that actually happen in the universe couldn't but happen. Why? Well, because the providentialist says that whatever events occur must occur given God's plan. Okay. Given that God's plan is the way that it is, the events that occur just have to conform to that plan. So whatever events actually occur are ones that must happen given that plan. So divine providence implies kind of a fatalistic or deterministic conception of the events of nature. Okay. But that fatalistic or deterministic conception of the events of nature in turn might be thought to undermine the possibility of human moral responsibility. Okay. Why so? Well, a natural idea is that you're morally responsible for what you do only if you could have done otherwise. Okay. Only if you had a choice, only if there was another option available to you. Okay. If I couldn't but have robbed the bank, okay, if I was forced into it, for example, okay, then you can't blame me for doing it. You can't hold me responsible for doing it. Okay. If I very loudly sneeze during the important talk, okay, I don't have a choice but to do that. So the stares that I get from the other audience members are unjustified. Okay, I couldn't help it. I couldn't have done otherwise. So I can't be held responsible for sneezing. And in general, you know, you're responsible for what you do only if you could have done otherwise. Okay, but as we've just seen, divine providence rules it out that we could have done otherwise for anything that we do. Okay, for anything that you do, you have to have done that thing because it's part of God's plan, right? And whatever occurs must occur in accordance with God's plan. Okay, so this is a second problem for providence. Rules out human responsibility. And notice, by the way, as an aside, if the argument that I've just given is right, that actually undermines the we're being punished response to the problem of natural evil that I considered earlier. Okay. Because if divine providence rules it out that we're morally responsible for what we do, okay, then it wouldn't be just for God to hold us responsible for past misdeeds by punishing us. Okay. And if it wouldn't be just for God to do that, then God wouldn't do it by the providentialist's own lights, because God is perfectly good. Okay. So if this argument concerning providence and fate is right, that's the end for the we're being punished response to the problem of natural evil. So there's a connection between the two problems here that might be interesting to highlight. Okay. Now, one of the premises in the argument that I just put forward is that we're morally responsible for our actions only if we could have done otherwise. Okay. That seems like a natural thought. Okay. But contemporary philosophers have questioned it. Is it really necessary for moral responsibility that we could have done otherwise? Can't we conceive of a case in which the agent couldn't have done otherwise, and yet it's still appropriate to hold them morally responsible? Well, this guy, Harry Frankfurt, a contemporary moral philosopher, has questioned that principle. He calls it the principle of alternative possibilities. Okay, and there's lots of different points that Frankfurt makes across his writings about the principle of alternative possibilities. But I just want to explore one aspect of Frankfurt's views. Okay, so Frankfurt asks us to consider someone who's heavily addicted to a drug. Okay. Now, suppose but this person doesn't want to be addicted to the drug in question. They're an unwilling addict. They find themselves with an urge to take a hit, okay, but they really, really don't want to be a person who is addicted to drugs. Okay. Now, suppose they go out, score a hit, okay, and inject it or whatever, okay. seems right to say that we can't hold them directly responsible for what they do in that moment when they're injecting the drug. Perhaps we can hold them responsible for getting addicted in the first place. But when they actually go ahead and take the hit, that very act is not something that we can hold them, directly responsible for. Frankfurt asks why. Okay. One suggestion is the principle of alternative possibilities. They couldn't have done otherwise. But Frankfurt points out that there's an alternative, equally natural explanation for why we'd want to say that the unwilling addict isn't morally responsible for what they do. It's because the unwilling addict is acting on a desire that they don't want to have. And in that sense, they're acting in a way that manifests a will, which is unfree. They're acting caused by a desire, but where they want not to have that desire. Okay? That's why the addict can't be held responsible for what they do. And what this suggests is actually that being morally responsible for what you do doesn't necessarily require the ability to do otherwise. What it requires is that you act on the basis of a certain pattern of desires. You act on the basis of a desire which you in turn want to have. As long as you fulfill that condition, you're morally responsible for what you do. Okay. And this is grist to the providentialist mill, if that's right. Because of course, it could be part of God's plan that we do go around with desires that we want to have and act on them. That's perfectly compatible with the idea of providence. Okay. Thus, the providentialists can borrow this Frankfurt-style analysis of moral responsibility to help them out with the problem of fatalism. That's one suggestion to think about. Okay, good. So I'll now move on to the fourth and final part of my my bit of the talk. I'm going to try and apply some of these ideas that we've been talking about to the contemporary COVID-19 crisis. Okay. Okay, good. So what I'm going to do, sorry, shouldn't have gone to that slide quite yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to raise two questions. The first question is, how should a theist respond to the COVID-19 crisis? The second question is, how should a non-theist, an agnostic or an atheist, respond? I'm going to try and lean on some of the ideas that we've already talked about in answer to those questions. Okay, so let's begin with the theist. How should a theist respond to the COVID-19 crisis? Okay, well, the COVID-19 crisis is a paradigm case, you might think, of natural evil, which is seemingly unjustified. We can imagine a world at which COVID never happened. Surely that would be a better world than the one we're actually in. Okay, doesn't this suggest that there's no such thing as divine providence? This is what a Voltaire would say. Okay. Now, in response, the theist could say one of three things. First, they could say, okay, yes, I'll bite the bullet. There is such a thing as God. God created the universe. Okay. But there is no divine plan that organizes the events of nature. Okay, I'm going to have to just give up on providentialism. God creates the universe and then just kind of leaves us to it. Okay, so that's one kind of response the theist could give. Second kind of response is to say that this is an act of divine punishment. Okay, that's the austere response. And the third kind of response is it's all part of the plan response, which we explored earlier. It's because we're cognitively limited that we can't see why the COVID crisis is morally justified. Those are the three responses. Perhaps one thing we can discuss later on is which of those is the most plausible, but I have one remark to make about it. You might think that the divine punishment response that the theist could give to COVID-19 isn't viable, because the spread of COVID-19 has been partly caused by poor hygiene practices on the part of human beings. And so it's us that have caused the COVID-19 crisis to occur. It can't really be interpreted as an act of divine punishment, can it? So I think that's a little bit of a cheap response. The theist can counter-respond to that just by pointing out that actually, although the event of COVID spreading in the way that it has might be caused by us. Nevertheless, the existence of the virus itself is what God has inflicted on us, and that's the act of divine punishment. Or it could be that some of the mistakes that led it to spread, that human beings have made, those mistakes were enabled to happen by an act of the divine, and that's God's punishment. Okay, so this idea that COVID is divine punishment, austere as it is, has coherence to it. It has some legs for the theist, anyway. So there's some reflections on what the theist could say about COVID. Okay, now let's have a think about what a non-theist could say. Okay, suppose we reject the idea of divine providence and indeed reject the idea that God exists at all. Okay, is there anything that the ideas of divine providence could teach us, nevertheless, about COVID-19? Well, some celebrities, environmentalists, and politicians have said some interesting things in this regard. Okay, in fact, I put on the handout, which should have been distributed to you, a link to some comments made by Jane Goodall, pictured at the top there, the environmentalist. But in the talk now, I'm going to focus on some thoughts that were expressed during an interview with the contemporary philosopher Miley Cyrus. Okay, consider what she says. I know some of us have seen the viral videos of bluer skies, dolphins in waters we haven't seen them in before. So Mother Nature, not only are we taking a break right now, but she's getting a little bit of relief because there are way fewer cars on the freeway. People aren't working every day, so we aren't vomiting into Mother Nature's beauty every single day. Okay. Now, of course, it's up to Cyrus scholars to determine the precise meaning of her words. Okay, but there's a strong whiff of ascribing agency to nature itself, to Mother Nature, capital M, capital N, about what Cyrus says here, and Jane Goodall likewise, if you watch the clip that I've linked you to. The idea that they seem to be expressing is something like this. Nature is itself an agent, like a kind of person that has its own goals and its own goods. Okay, and the COVID-19 crisis is justified from the moral point of view because it enables nature to heal itself from wounds that have been inflicted on it by human beings and their modes of living. Okay, now that's a very providentialist idea, albeit one that's kind of naturalized, if you think about it. Because with the providentialist, according to the providentialist, the idea is that there is this being, an agent, who orders events in accordance with a plan that they have. Okay, and we're to justify the existence of natural evils partly by appeal to the existence of this entity. Cyrus and Goodall say something similar. It's just that the entity isn't God, but Mother Nature. Okay. You might think, well, look, one question to ask is, if you have no truck with the idea of divine providence, are you also going to find plausible the idea that Mother Nature is an agent or a being? Okay, maybe not. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Anyway, okay, so I'll just finish now with a further thought. Suppose we reject any kind of spiritualist view whatsoever. Suppose we reject both divine providence and the idea that the natural world is an agent with their own goods. Okay, suppose we're just an out and out naturalist who doesn't believe in any of that. Can the idea of divine providence still teach us anything of value about how we are to respond to COVID-19? Well, perhaps it can. Okay, so I have a small suggestion to make. With respect to divine providence, we can distinguish between two things, two ideas. One is a metaphysical idea, okay, and the other is an ethical idea. The metaphysical idea we've already come across. The metaphysical idea is that there exists this entity, God, okay, and that the events in the world unfold in perfect accordance with their ideally good plan. That's a metaphysical idea. But here's an ethical idea that might survive the rejection of that metaphysical idea. The ethical idea is that an aspect of the good life for human beings, what makes your life go well, is you're having a disposition to look back on the events that have occurred, that have affected you, with an attitude of acceptance, to treat them as if they were fated, and to find a kind of positive acceptance directed towards those events precisely in that fact. These are the events that have happened, and I thereby accept them. Someone who's disposed to feel that way retrospectively is someone, you might think, who is psychologically healthy. Okay. This is the kind of ethical idea that's at least in the vicinity of providence and that might survive the rejection of the metaphysical idea. It's roughly the idea that Nietzsche expressed with this phrase, amor fati. I can't pronounce it probably because I don't speak Latin, but it translates as love of one's fate. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it. Okay. Nietzsche thinks that the ideal human being is one who's capable of displaying this amor fati attitude. And perhaps that's an idea which even the atheist could accept is a good one. And it's an idea that's at least in the vicinity of divine providence. Okay, so that's it for me. Thanks very much for listening. There's now another vote which you're going to be asked to engage in. I hope that will come up on your screens shortly. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So there it is. Should have come up on your screen.
Well, thank you both for that really, really interesting talk. I've been taking copious notes all the way through, so I found it absolutely fascinating. We will open up for Q&A in just a moment. I can see the poll is still going on. About half of you, I think, have voted at the moment, so I'll leave that open just for a few minutes longer. But maybe I can start the questions. Dafydd, I've one for you. Who during the 18th century was considered to have won the debate between Voltaire and Rousseau?
Voltaire's view was widely criticised. It was very controversial. He published the poem that I'm talking about, as well as Candide, anonymously, because he knew that they would be controversial. He amended the poem that he first published because it was viewed as being too depressing, and so he added an extra verse which made reference to human hope as part of life. Rousseau considered that he'd won it. He had a sort of the novel idea that he insisted that Voltaire never replied directly to Rousseau's letter. He never actually sent a letter back. And so Rousseau said that Candide was Voltaire's reply to him, on the one hand, but then he also said that he never bothered reading Candide anyway because there was no need for him to read it. So he tried to hold those two things together. And they died the same year, despite Rousseau being a younger man. They had an intertwined relationship, love-hate relationship. Voltaire, very critical in other letters of Rousseau's other writings, as I mentioned in the talk, about being an enemy of civilization and learning. So it's a sort of, Voltaire in effect wins because he remains the more prominent Enlightenment philosopher over Rousseau in the 18th century itself. But at the same time, the view that Rousseau put forward was actually the more popular view in that sense at that time, because it was controversial to be as pessimistic as Voltaire.
So in other words, they both won.
Well, right.
May I ask a brief follow-up, Dafydd? What did people make of Rousseau's suggestion that we respond to the problem of evil just by accepting that maybe God isn't omnipotent. That's quite a
Yeah,
very
good.
controversial thing, isn't it?
Yeah, no,
yeah.
it is. I mean, there's so much in what we have to remember here. I mean, the letter's much longer than I gave the impression of, I think, perhaps, and that Rousseau was viewed as such an idiosyncratic figure, and there's so much that goes on in the letter that people didn't pick out these individual things to focus off and respond to always. It's a good question whether there's a wider adaptation of the view of God's attributes to fit in with the process of providence, which there is in the wider. I mean, I'm always very hesitant to put it in these terms, but the wider deistic movement, of which you can in various ways view Voltaire and Rousseau as very different parts, does pay some attention to that when it starts to change the whole nature of God. So in Britain, you have the great deist John Toland, and he starts to present what seems to be a rather pantheistic view of God. Also, what Voltaire and Rousseau definitely agree on is that there is going to be universal salvation. So that's another difference as well, which makes their view controversial from a conventional Judeo-Christian sense, that it's not there's divine punishment at the end for certain people. So there are lots of different strands that fitted together to make it. I mean, this is why the encyclopedia, of which Rousseau, the other philosophers, Diderot and so on, D'Holbach, that the encyclopedia itself was shut down by the French authorities. So this is where Rousseau and in particular and other Voltaire get caught up into the French Revolution. They wanted to get rid of the oppressive networks of the Ancien regime, which was controlling religious and practices and attitudes. So yeah, it has an influence and shades into lots of different parts, the points of divine attribute, but interestingly not the most significant or controversial part of the letter or the wider debate.
Thank you for that, Dafydd. Joe, you spoke at quite length about sort of moral responsibility and whether it requires the ability to do otherwise. What do you believe?
Yes, it's a good question. So I think I'm probably on Frankfurt's side. I don't think moral responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise, partly for the reasons that I gave during the talk. I mean, what it requires, in my view, is that you perform an action that has a certain kind of source. It's an action that is caused by a desire that you identify with. This is just to kind of elaborate some of the thoughts that I was describing to Frankfurt earlier. So as long as the desire that you act on the basis of is part of your sort of identity as an agent, okay, this is a desire that you want to have, that you identify with. It's a desire that you want to have governing your life. That suffices for the action to be free. But nevertheless, one could act guided by such a desire, even though one couldn't do otherwise. Okay, because one's actions are predetermined by the events of nature plus the laws of nature, or predetermined by God's will, or whatever it is. Okay, so I think in a nutshell, I agree with Frankfurt. I want to elaborate his views a little bit more in terms of this notion of identity, practical identity, but he's broadly right, I think. And that's good news for the providentialist, of course, as I suggested. Yes.
Thank you for that. So we've had a suggestion from Valerie saying that most of these thinkers seem to assume a degree of univocity. So maybe God's definition or concept of goodness is different from humans' definition or concept of goodness. And would that help to answer the problem?
So I have a couple of remarks about that, if that's okay.
Yeah,
go. I think this is kind of similar to the all is well response to the problem of evil that both Dafydd and I discussed. I mean, maybe you have a different interpretation of it, Dafydd. And do say, Valerie, if you think I'm misconstruing what you're saying. But it seems to me that the idea here is that there's good as we understand it, and then there's good as God understands it, and good as God understands it is the way goodness is. That's really what goodness is. We understand it in a kind of limited, in a limited human way. Okay, we don't fully understand it, and if we don't fully understand it, then that leaves room for the providentialist to say, well, look, you don't fully understand what goodness is. Okay, so for all you know, okay, these natural evils are morally justified. Okay, I suppose one worry that you might have about that kind of view is that it makes everyday moral decision making quite difficult. You might think that it goes a bit too far, because if for all I know, so if I don't really fully understand what goodness is, then how am I to know, how am I to be certain, how am I even to be particularly confident that various mundane actions that I perform aren't actually morally bad in a way that I just don't understand? Okay, oh dear. So you might think this view, according to which there is this sort of cognitive gap between us and God vis-a-vis morality, leads to a kind of moral skepticism across the board. That might be one kind of worry. Dafydd, I don't know whether you.
It's certainly the case that Valerie's right that a lot of these Enlightenment figures in particular do assume a connection between God's goodness, God's connotation of goodness and human connotation of goodness, and this is the emphasis here is that human beings are rational creatures and God is perfect reason. So there must be some connection with what humans intuit or understand as good and what God denotes by it. It is, of course, an answer though that you're right to suggest that there isn't an analogy there between those two points of view, and that starts to emerge earlier, as well as and then returns. So merges in particular the Reformation, radical Protestant figures. Luther, Calvin comes back again in the 20th century with Karl Barth in particular, where he talk about the radical transcendence of God. So it isn't actually possible to put those things in those terms. And that's because they have then a different norm. Morality is not defined by what is reasonable, by a moral law that is objective. Morality is defined by other things, not least by God's will itself. That's what's called voluntarism. What God commands is good, and human beings have what is good revealed to them. So you're right, there are different ways of pursuing the problem. The word you use there, theodicy, this is a Leibnizian term. This is Leibniz's great book. So he would not like us to push too far away, except in the sense, as we talked about optimism, that if you start to think that you can see the whole thing, you mistake good for evil. That's part of the switch there.
Thank you both for those words. So going back to sort of what Jane Goodall and Miley Cyrus were suggesting, that sort of Mother Nature has some degree of agency. We've had a comment, if the natural world is an agent, would it also be a creation of God, or would it coexist with God? That's
an excellent question. Yes, and there's lots of things that are to be said about it. It depends on what properties the proponent of this natural world as agent view is wanting to ascribe to Mother Nature, capital M, capital N. Okay, if they're wanting to ascribe properties like omniscience, and omnipotence and omnibenevolence, okay, then it's going to become plausible to identify nature with God, which is, of course, Spinoza's view, roughly. Okay. If, on the other hand, Mother Nature is seen as being limited, not being omniscient or omnipotent, it would be coherent, perhaps not plausible, but it would at least be coherent to say that God exists in concurrence with this other entity, Mother Nature, as well. Because if Mother Nature is limited in the ways that I've described, then the entity in question couldn't be plausibly identified with God. Dafydd, what do you think? There's lots to be said.
Yeah, there is lots to be said. I mean, it depends on all sorts of things. I think Joe's right to make Spinoza. That's I think all of our first thought when that comes up. Just Spinoza having a distinction: natura naturans, natura naturata. So nature as it always is, nature as it's becoming. But this is a radical, what's called panentheist view. So God is in some sense different from nature, but nature is still part of God. So rather than just pantheist, where God is everything. Of course, what's interesting there is the use of the word creation, because part of the whole idea of Judeo-Christian view in particular, as opposed to a pantheistic view, even a Neoplatonic view, take Plotinus, ancient Greece, the world isn't chosen to create, it's just created as it comes out of the goodness of the one. Part of the idea in the Judeo-Christian framework is that God chooses to create and creates something other to him, or it, depending how you want to put it. So the world isn't an agent at all, but precisely because it is created to be a theatre for other agents which have aspects that make them appear like God, reason in this case. It's, if you look back to the emergence of early modern science, what you have view there is a sort of in-between view that there is a type of agency in nature, because what underpins nature is a substance which is a spiritual substance. So it's matter. Matter doesn't possess a soul, but at the same time, it's not the matter like the earth. It's a divine mediating substance and that's how God imprints order on the universe. And so this is actually something that Isaac Newton took over, and Joseph in his Acceptance of Alchemy, and Joseph Danville. So there are, as Joe said, there's lots of different ways you can push the image of agent creation and coexistence to go in all sorts of radical and literally esoteric directions.
Wow, that's given me a lot to ponder on. Thank you so much. We're getting close to the end of our time now. Did you want to reveal the results of the polls?
That would be great. Can I just, there's a message in the chat from Isabel, just briefly say, which is that you can't compare earthquakes and pandemics. This is a great point. I mean, remember that Voltaire does compare, and so do Rousseau. They do talk about plagues and earthquakes in the same way. And what Isabel's getting out there, making it difficult to choose, really is part of Rousseau's point about all natural disasters. So he wants to say, yes, it does seem more obvious that plagues are human responsibility rather than earthquakes, much as you're saying there. But at the same time, wants to point out we make earthquakes worse, more of a disaster, in the same way we make pandemics or outbreaks of plagues worse than they are. I remember this is a time in human history that really is the dominant way of living life until perhaps really the sort of early 20th century, to be plagues were rife, outbreaks of plagues in cities, and were a more common feature of life than we've been used to. So sorry, but Kathy, yes, it'd be great to reveal the poll. I think it's on there.
Yeah, let me just pull them up again. So for the first poll, 61% sided with Rousseau compared to 39% with Voltaire. So I guess that sort of echoes with you saying that Rousseau's opinions were quite popular at the time.
Sure.
And maybe still are.
Yes, I suppose that an emphasis that people like the idea of human interaction, some human responsibility, and not the absolute pessimism of Voltaire, perhaps.
So I'm now going to share the results of the second poll.
Do you think the world is controlled by divine providence? No.
So 3/4 are saying not controlled by divine providence. And are humans responsible? So we've got 69% saying yes, 31% saying no. What's your response to that?
I mean, on the first question, I would be very interested to know whether there are any in the no camp who think that, there might well be a God. It's just that even if there were, there wouldn't be such a thing as divine providence. Because one way of responding no is just to say, well, I'm an atheist, so there is no God. Okay, so ipso facto, no divine providence. But I think a more interesting question is, even if there is a God, should we believe in divine providence? Okay, I'll be interested to know who amongst the no camp, if anybody, is of that view.
It's a shame we can't put another poll up
Well, no,
quickly
that's
now.
right.
But
Yes.
But it's a good point, Joe, because I mean that actually is more Newtonian than Leibnizian.
Yes.
That sort of view, right? That the world is not a machine that just functions without any interaction whatsoever. It doesn't just go on by itself. I mean, Newton actually had a view that God interacts with creation. I mean, Leibniz thought there was no such thing as miracles. I mean, that's another question here. Remember, you can have divine providence. A strict view of divine providence, people like Leibniz, means that you don't think there's such things as miracles. God doesn't arbitrarily involve himself with creation because he's created a perfect machine. So, but as you say, part of the point about the questions there is that it elicits this difference of where you put the emphasis. God might exist, but how does he involve himself with creation, and so on.
Well, we could continue this debate for hours, couldn't we? But unfortunately, our time is up. So thank you both to Dafydd and Joe for entertaining us, for making us really engage our brains and think about what we believe. So fantastic evening. I've really enjoyed it. I do hope our audience have too. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for this evening. I'm going to go and reabsorb all the notes that I've written and go back and read all the documents that you've provided to us. But thank you so much. And to our audience, we will see you at the next event. Good night.
Thanks for listening. Thank you.